Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast, third season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. This is an amazing episode because Neil Kleid returns to the mothership to discuss Nice Jewish Boys, now on Comixology. Now come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Kleid. Thank you so much for coming to the Versus Stars podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's really my pleasure. So you are now the writer for Nice Jewish Boys, which was released on Comixology. So what motivated the choice to go to Comixology, and what are the benefits of publishing through Comixology Originals?
Sure. So I had already done a book with Comixology Originals called The Panic, which came out during the pandemic. And it was about a group of New Yorkers who get caught in a subway crash under the Hudson and have to kind of work together to get out. And so I had a really good experience working with them. It was me and Andrea Moody. We were the co-authors on that book. And well, we were kind of getting to the end of that, the creation part of it. Not we hadn't put the book out yet, but just sort of like finishing making it. I had reached out to Chip Mosher, who was running Comixology at the time, and said, "What are we doing next?" And he said, "What you got?" And so I threw him some ideas. I had this really great idea for this book, Nice Jewish Boys. I said I really kind of wanted to do it there. My friend John Broglia, who I worked with on a book called Savor, was going to draw it. And Chip looked it over and said, "This is really great. I really like the first issue. Let's go." And so it just was sort of like a natural progression of working with a publisher, working with a team that you like, and wanting to continue that experience. It's been pretty great in terms of kind of the immediacy of it. The great thing about Comixology is that they're digital first, and when you kind of put something out, you can kind of get it out to everyone immediately, right? Nobody has to go to the store. Nobody has to kind of wait for a pre-order. They can really download it the day it comes out, read it immediately, and give you feedback, give you kind of their thoughts on it. And so that's been really great. The downside is that you have to wait for print, right? So you have to wait to kind of get it into somebody's hands. With the Panic, we were lucky in that when the fifth issue came out, we already had a print date for the Panic. So it came out 1 month, and then like 4 or 5 months later, it was already in stores, right? It had been offered to be a diamond, and through Dark Horse. Dark Horse Comics does all the print editions of the Comixology books. With Nice Jewish Boys, we ran into a little bit of a snag. Comixology has recently redone their print deal with Dark Horse, and Dark Horse, because of market issues, has decided not to print everything that the Comixology Originals puts out. And one of the books, amongst a handful of books that they've decided not to print, is Nice Jewish Boys. And so, thankfully, Comixology is a great team. We learn, we pivot real quickly, and the plan is to still pursue printing the book. We're just working on some options right now. So hopefully, within the next several months, we'll figure out who's going to do it, how we're going to do it, and I've already promised myself we will get this book into people's hands.
I hope so. And like I said, I think it was the Panic is the book that you were on last to talk about. I think it was the Panic. If
Right.
memory serves. I'll check our interview library. I'm pretty sure that's what it was.
Yep.
So the interesting thing is, Nice Jewish Boys. It was a great series. I enjoyed reading it. As
Yeah.
someone who's also Jewish, I definitely appreciated it quite a bit. So as you said, the artist on the book is John. How do you pronounce the last name?
John Broglia.
Roglia.
Yep.
So how does this team come together, and what does he bring to the table?
Right. So the team is actually John, and then Ellie Wright is our colorist, and then we always include Sarah Litt, who's our editor, as sort of the fourth member of the team. All four of us really brought something special to the table and really our A game to this project. For me, it was obviously the story, the background. It's very intimate to me. It's about my community, right? It's a very Jewish story. I'm Jewish. I'm an Orthodox Jew, so it's about the Orthodox Jewish community. What John brought to it was reality, right? So John is very good about taking an experience that maybe isn't his own, or one that is his own, and really kind of getting deeply embedded into it to the point where he brings that sort of like intimacy and depth of character to the page. And you can definitely see it in Nice Jewish Boys. It was really great. I had John come out. The book is set in Teaneck, New Jersey, which is where I'm from. It's a little suburb right next to the city, right next to New York City. It's heavily populated with Jews and I mean other races and religions. But I really wanted John to get a feel for the town. And so the summer before the book came out, I had him actually come out here for a day, and I drove him around, and we took a lot of photo reference and saw a lot of places, and he really kind of got into like what Teaneck is and what it offers to the Jewish community here. And so I really appreciated that, and I think he is, from an artist, perspective, he's very good at really connecting to the work he's gonna try. And I mean, if you read the book and you look at the work that he did on this, as well as on Savor, our last book, the facial expressions, the way that the characters sort of are presented on the page. I mean, there's such emotional connection to the reader. It's just fantastic. And Ellie, who's our colorist, we've been wanting to work with her for a while. She's worked with a bunch of people, a bunch of comics, a bunch of series, and she brings this real great vibrancy to the page that not only makes it feel kind of like full of life, but also really highlights some of the darker parts of the book. So like we go from like really like dark scenes out, in midnight on the street, all the way to like a bright bar mitzvah reception hall, right? So like the fact that she can really expand the palette to include both aspects of like a family communal crime story, I think is really great. Has really been great. And Sarah, finally, I don't want to leave Sarah off. I've known Sarah Lit for a long time, and we've always wanted to work together on a project. And we were lucky enough to get her to come edit this one, and she has been crucial for me. I've been second guessing myself a lot on this book, as you do when it's so close and intimate and and personal. And she's been really great about helping keep the narrative on track, helping us understand like what we're, there's definitely something that I've been wanting to say, and you know, pushing back when we've sort of strayed from that. And she's also been great, obviously, at keeping the train on running on time. So I love working with Sarah. I definitely want to work with her again.
So I think it's interesting on the Jewish boys. Once again, it's very specific to on some level to the culture of Judaism and Jews living in this country. When you're thinking about your approach to the comic book, do you view it as a Jewish story, or is it still an American story that's giving a certain context?
So it's funny because when you read, I don't want to give away the comic, but like when you read the comic, you can basically get to a point where you're like, look, this can happen to anyone at any time, right? So for those who aren't familiar with it, the book is about a guy named Jake Levin. He's a writer like me, and he is struggling financially, and has to pay for a bar mitzvah that's coming up, and not just a bar mitzvah, but all of his bills, and he's just having trouble finding work. And a buddy of his basically says, "Hey, come work for me, writing emails and doing marketing." And through happenstance and circumstance, whatever, he gets kind of sucked into a criminal operation that's being run out of the back of the shop. And so the book is about him struggling with loyalty to his friend versus loyalty to the law versus also loyalty to God and faith, and really like what he's willing to do in order to um, provide for his family and also be okay with the fact that he's hurting his community. And so that's really what the book is about. And ultimately, I kind of feel like some of the themes are really relatable, whether you're Jewish or not, right? Um, we've all gotten to the point where we've been desperate or struggling or have had trouble financially or have to make decisions about loyalty to the people we love or the people we like or the people that we're connected to versus something that's really kind of more personal, right? Like,
Hmm.
will I sacrifice my principle here because I need to do X, Y, and Z, or this person needs X, Y, and Z, and though I don't necessarily like love what I'm doing here, I'm going to do it because I want to support that person, right? But there's also a sense of like I have a family, I have responsibilities to my family. Personally, I have 4 kids. I'm married. I have a house. There are financial responsibilities that come with that. I have to put food on the table. I have to pay the mortgage. I have to, there's school. There's all these things, and the question then becomes like when you're having trouble meeting those responsibilities, and desperation sets in, right? What are you willing to? What part of your principles are you willing to set aside to make sure
Hmm.
that food gets on the table? Is it none? Is it some? Right? And then also, one of the questions that I had was, if I had a friend who I knew was, a criminal, and he's been my friend for 30 years, would I turn him in? Right? Like, would I? Is it something that I'd be comfortable saying, like, well, he's my buddy and we're brothers, and I'm going to turn him in, or is it something where I'm going to say, let me figure out a way to help him, kind of like either stop doing what he's doing or hide his crimes, right? So these are all really good moral and ethical questions that I don't think you need to be Jewish
Hmm.
to approach, right? This can happen no matter who you are. And we kind of say that a little bit in the story, that this could happen whether you're in New Jersey, Los Angeles, anywhere around the world, whether you're Jewish, you're not Jewish, no matter your race, religion, background. People get desperate. People have, lines that they're willing to cross and then lines that they're not willing to cross. And
Mm.
ultimately, that's what's at the heart of this book.
Now, the story also kind of brings up a couple of big ideas, or a lot of big ideas, but there's a few that we'll dive into. There's also the concept of free will versus a fate idea. Once, at what point in the story, I kind of feel like there's a certain level point where Jake loses the free will on some level to back out. Like he's kind of like stuck on a train at some point, and it keeps on going forward kind of quickly. Um, was there a point you think where he could have walked away without dealing with the consequences the way he had to?
So it's funny that you mentioned that, because I just had this conversation with somebody last week who was talking about how much they love the book. But ultimately, if you go back and look at sort of the decisions that Jake makes towards, especially towards, the last two issues, he's not really making those decisions, right? He's just sort of, as you said, on kind of a train
Yeah.
and has to just basically react, right? The decisions are kind of taken out of his hands to some sense. And ultimately, like, what I kind of have to do is put myself into that situation and say, like, would I be able to personally, like, tell myself I have agency here and here's what I'm going to do because of that? Sometimes people don't have agency in those situations. It is
Mm.
what it is, and you kind of have to react. And, like, if you look at any of these watch any crime television show or movie, right, where somebody's an informant, right? Perfect example, Adriana from The Sopranos, right? Adriana from The Sopranos, who is just entrapped in this situation where she really can't get out. And there's that one great moment, for those of you who haven't seen The Sopranos, um, where, like, there's a moment where you see her driving down the highway, like, away from New Jersey with a suitcase in her car, with the music blaring, and there's a moment for you as a viewer where you're like, oh my god, she made the decision to just run, right? Like, she had the mob at her back, and then she had the feds at her back, and she decided, I want out, and she just goes. And you're like, good for her. And then you find out that it's like a dream, and then she's just sort of trapped in this terrible situation that leads to her grisly end, right? And so I think a lot of us sometimes are in that position where you're just kind of like, oh my god, the bills are due and I have to pay all these bills and I can't find work, or I have work and I'm not able to pay the bill. And, like, what do I do? Like, I can't, there's nothing I can personally do other than ask for help.
Now, I mean, many points of the story, and a lot of the story, some of the main ideas is looking for forgiveness from his God and trying to find the I'm trying to think of the right word, not really approval of God, but once again being the good graces of God to the story. Now, one question you can ask is based on once his life kind of starts drifting away from his control, where is God in that to Jake?
In which aspect? The drifting away aspect, or
The point where potentially his agency starts falling apart, and is there a point where there's a question of could God step in that he's asking for help, or is that even
yeah,
a
I
thing?
mean, and that's a question that he sort of asks in the comic, is right, like, how much of this is under my control? How much of this is just my life, and, is God either going to help me, or is God gonna, like, is God there? Is God listening? Right? And he does ask that at one point in the comic, right? Have I gone too far for God to take me back? And I think those are questions that are not easily answered, right? Like,
Hmm.
I can ask the same thing for myself, right? If I go out and I get into a car crash, right? Where was God, right? Or if I make the decision to do something stupid to get me into the car crash, was that me or was that God, right? So, like, it's a really dicey thing, free will, right? You're not really sure how much free will you actually really have. I can tell you from my background, right, as a religious Orthodox Jew, there's really a lot of conversations about free will, about, like, God. Yes, God has a plan, and, we believe God has a plan, and we believe that God is uh, there for us when we need God, and God is also there for when, we have to be punished, right? And so the free will aspect comes really more on that sort of latter side, like when we're being punished. like it's up to us to notice that, right? Like, oh, this is God's doing this because I did X, Y, and Z, and here's how I'm going to take my free will and sort of affect change. Um, I I feel like I'm a man of faith, and I feel like everything that good that happens to me in my life, like I'll thank God for. Right? There'll be a moment where I get a book greenlit, or I'll get a new job, or something wonderful happens to my family, and there's a moment that I take where it's like, hey, thanks God, right? Like ultimately, this couldn't have happened without your hand. It's a lot harder for a person to say, I get it, God, when you've done something, when something bad happens, right? Like a lot of the times people will curse God. People, will curse and say, like, why are you doing this to me? Or like, why is this happening? And I can just speak for myself. I'm not, and I know people out there will basically call me naive or say, hey, you're being kind of a child in this situation. But like, all I can do is operate on my own gut, right? So for me, the hardest parts of my life is being able to stop and say, okay, this happened. It's terrible. I can recognize why it happened. I know how I have to fix it. But the hardest part is the acknowledgement of God, you did this, your hand was in this for a reason. And that's tough, like from a faith POV, right? And so for Jake, I don't know. I don't know how much free will Jake ultimately, obviously, he doesn't because I'm writing it. But like, I'm God in this situation. But ultimately, I think the moment of him sort of saying, like, learning, like, okay, I need to take responsibility for my actions. And even though I may be naive and think like, okay, as long as I do tshuva, everything will be fine. As long as I repent, everything will be fine. That might be, a lot of people may see that as childish or naive, but I think that's where the free will comes in. That's the free will is him saying, all right, I have to take one step at a time to become a better person, whether God is listening or not. This is kind of the way I have to go. And you kind of have to ultimately be okay with that personally, right? Like that's not something that you can have somebody say to you, like, you're right, because every person is their own person, right? The way we talked about agency a second ago for Jake, right? Like other people may have written this differently, right? This is just how I would have,
Hmm.
maybe reacted. And ultimately, I'm just really the vehicle through which the story is coming out. And so for me, that's how I felt the story should go.
And it's kind of interesting from, as you mentioned, you're being the writer, in some way being the god of the story, because you're the one who. How much of the story do you feel that the character took on himself, and it went his direction? How much do you feel it's once again your hand determining where he had to go?
So a lot of it changed. I will say the ending changed, right? From the pitch to the page. Um, the ending you see at Nice Jewish Boys #5 was not the original ending. And it literally came about through a series of conversations that I had with Sarah, my editor, saying like, well, this is really kind of what has to happen, and we have to change this. Like I don't think, there's a great story about um, the Phoenix and the X-Men, right? Jean Grey, the Phoenix. For those who are familiar, this character who commits, like destroys a planet as the Phoenix, and then ultimately like gets rid of the Phoenix and becomes a hero again.
Hmm.
And the original story was that she was going to survive. The Phoenix was going to leave, and she was going to end up without powers, living like a normal life, a normal human life. And I guess it was Jim Shooter or somebody, some editors basically said like, well, she really has to die. Like, you can't like do that and not get and just get away with it. And so that's why the story changed where Jean Grey dies at the end, right? She dies. Spoiler for those who have not read the now classic 40-year-old story of X-Men story. So um, with this one, it's sort of not that I'm comparing myself to the story of Chris Claremont, the Phoenix, but it really kind of became one of those moments where we were in like issue 3, and I was finishing the script for issue 3, and I was just kind of thinking about the rest of the story. And I called Sarah or emailed Sarah, and I was like, I think this has to change now because of X reasons, right? And so some of that was me, right? It was me, and some of it was Jake. Some of it was just the characters sort of take a life on of their own. I've been really clear to people who have read this story. There's a lot of similarities to my life on the page, right? If you read these pages and you know me well, and you know where I come from, and you know the people who live around me and the people I'm friendly with, there's a lot of similarities. There are a lot of things that are not me, though. There's a
Mhm.
lot of aspects of this character and the decisions the character would make. And there's a
So,
lot of
so you're not part of potential a murder that you were
no, no, no. I'm
suspicious
not a
into?
criminal. I'm
All
not
right,
the
just
part of
checking
a
that was
criminal
you said some
enterprise.
is similar, so I was wondering which parts, you know?
Right, but even obviously beyond the fanciful crime aspects, but even just some decisions about religion and faith, and some things that he says throughout, right? Um, I'm obviously there are things that are me, like the story is a little bit of a vehicle for me to say a few things that have been on my mind for the last couple of years.
Hmm.
But for the most part, it's really this is what this character in this situation would say, right? It happens to be that we're both white Jewish writers from New Jersey, right? But I could be telling the story about, somebody who's not in my lived experience, um, and that reaction could be completely different. So I think the commonalities sort of shoot me in the foot a little bit because he and I are so close. We're both
Hmm.
sort of the same age, the same job, the same life, kind of. But I was pretty clear in saying that like it's about the character in this narrative, right? And this
Hmm.
character in this narrative would operate in this manner, right? Just like the Phoenix would operate in this manner, or the people who are after them would operate in this manner, right? And so I'm always pretty clear on that. Yes, as the god slash writer of the story, most of the decisions are mine. But I will also say that a lot of the decisions were made based on context, character, what's going on in the world, what's going on in that community, what that community is like, right? Like if you think about Jews, right? Um, there's tons of different kinds of Jews in the world, and you can even see some of differentiations within the story itself. You've got Orthodox and you have ultra Orthodox, and then there's Reform, conservative, and we talk about it a little bit in the comic, how each Jew really kind of operates from a different level of faith. What's
Hmm.
good for one person may not be good for another person, right? Like somebody who's a reform liberal Jew from California may act differently in this story than Jake, who I think is maybe like liberal to conservative, um, and very orthodox religious, right? So when I'm telling a story like this, I have to kind of take those
Hmm.
traits and those pieces and parts and say like, well, ultimately this is what he would say, right? There were things that like other characters said in it that I would never say, right? Like the villain is a horrible person who says very conservative right wing things that I would never say in my life because that's just not who I am. And so as a writer, you have to be able to tell stories like that. You have to be able to say like, well, this character would do this thing or say this thing because that's who they are in this
Hmm.
situation.
Now, there's another cool part in the story talking about writers and God and all this other stuff. There's an aspect where I think it's without giving too much away, Jake's, I believe, at an inner synagogue, there's a story being shared, I think, by his son about about God and the Bible, and he switches over a little bit to tell us to show the line of Stan Lee, great with great power comes great responsibility. I thought, what a great combination to have God and Stan Lee almost on equal footing in the teach to teach a lesson to this man.
So what's funny about that, and for those who read Nice Jewish Boys #5, which everything was leading to that, just for those who haven't read it, it's the subplot through this of the story is that Jake is trying to pay for this bar mitzvah for his son, and throughout the story, his son is like, "Hey, help me write this speech," and he's like, "I don't have time, I don't have time," and then finally at the end, you get into the synagogue, and his son Parker gets up to make the speech, and Jake has heard it for the first time, and it's about responsibility. And it really is one of the things that really solidifies his conscience, solidifies his who he is, and pushes Jake forward to do what he has to do with in the issue. Um, the best part about it is that at one point I do kind of use the "with great power must also come with great responsibility" speech from Stan Lee. And the parallels to my life is that I use that exact most of that speech in my own son's bar mitzvah back in 2021, where I use the "must also come with great responsibility" to sort of spur my son into being responsible. And so I had a really great moment where I could take this bar mitzvah speech from my life and insert it into the narrative. Um, And I will go on record and say that it is probably it is the first most accurate representation of a bar mitzvah speech in comic books. The only other one that I know about is a Ben Grimm Thing bar mitzvah speech that Dan Slott wrote a couple years back.
Hmm.
Mine is more accurate because it actually is based off a Torah portion that would be spoken in a bar mitzvah, whereas Ben's was just a general Torah portion that could have been from anywhere. So, gotcha, Dan. I'm accurate.
I mean, I really like I said, I really did love the comic book. Because like I said, series, I think one of the things I appreciate as well is that it's entertaining, but also educational. It gives you an insight into a community. You had that nice Jewish glossary at the end of the book, which I found extremely helpful. Like I said, well, being Jewish, I don't practice that much, so I didn't know the lingo, so it was great to have a dive in, and be like, oh, a little education for myself, which was fantastic.
Look, I'm a big believer in reading and experiencing stories, whether they're comics or movies or books or whatever, that are outside of my sphere of life influence, like just are outside of like the world that I live in, right?
Hmm.
Um, I want to be brought into other communities, into other religions, into other people's lives, and like learn from them and learn something that I don't know, right? Um, One of the things that I was really aware about with this book, and somebody actually, I think a family member said to me, like, who the hell's going to buy this thing? And I said, what do you mean? They're like, yeah, you'll get the Jews to buy it. You'll get like specifically Teaneck Jews to buy it. But is somebody in Oklahoma going to buy this comic? Is somebody, in Ireland? And like, is someone who is not who doesn't know our community? Well, who's even going to care? And so ultimately, I said, like I said before, it's about like how you can relate to the story on a level outside. Like it's about the human connection. But I did want to make sure that for those who were kind of entering our world, that they didn't feel completely lost. And so I did this actually with The Big Con, which is one of my earlier graphic novels, which was also set in New Jersey, which did have some Yiddish and Hebrew slang in there. I put a glossary at the end because I was like, I don't want to have footnotes throughout the book that will break you up from like I used to love those like Marvel footnotes from editors, right? Like where you were like, oh, and when we were out in space, and then it's like here's the issue when they were out in space, and you that kind of like breaks the narrative for me. So what I wanted to do was just present the language, the cadence, the pattern, like the rhythm of the language in a way that felt natural, that would felt like you were there and you were part of the conversation, and then leave the glossary at the end for like, look, if you want to go back through this, like on first read, hopefully the dialogue is clear enough that even though you may not know some of the words, you can kind of get what's being
Hmm.
sold, what's being sold, right? You can get like, okay, I know what this means, or I know what that means, or I can kind of get it from context of what's happening. But what I wanted to do for each issue was collect all those words at the end and say, look, if you want, go back through it and read it, and here's what they all mean.
Hmm.
Um, and hopefully, when we do a print edition, there'll be one big glossary at the end for all 5 issues. So for me, it's just about like, this is our world, this is our neighborhood, our community. There's really the cost of entry is not expensive, but there are definitely some tribal and cultural things you need to know for context, and there's also a little bit of a language barrier in some cases. So on my part, as the publisher, writer, designer, I wanted to make sure that we included that glossary because I thought it was super important.
Now, another interesting thing about the time that is published, I feel, and maybe I'm right or not right, that there's definitely an uptick in anti-Semitism going on, especially in this country, for reasons that can or cannot have to go into, but it's there. There on social media, it's there in the world. Was there a risk of publishing the book?
Yeah, and I mean, if you read the issues and you go, especially at the end of issue 1 or issue 5, I've got like a little bit of like a whether you want to call it back matter essay or like printed apology. I, I I asked myself this along the way, especially with Sarah. She and I spoke about this a lot, which was, is this bad for the Jews? Am I telling the story that ultimately will hurt my community? And that was not the intent, right? The intent was, look, I'm a very big believer in Jewish representation in all forms of literature and film and television, like any sort of medium that can be consumed. I think we need more original Jewish stories. Usually, when you read a book or movie that's made by Jews about Judaism, there's definitely this sense of like, we're the light unto the nations and we're good people and we always have God in our minds. And it's always about hope and joy. And I love that. And I am proud to be a Jew and I'm full of hope and joy and I love my community and I love God, right? But I will say that when I'm watching, let's say, an action movie, it would be nice if once the action hero was somebody like me, right? You know, Orthodox dude with a kippah out there, like, being Jack Bauer fighting criminals, right? We don't get that a lot. We're the lawyers, we're the accountants, we're in entertainment, right? That's kind of like the stereotype. Or we're the best friends, right? The Jewish best friend. That's kind of a big thing. Um, Adam Sandler actually put out a great movie recently called The Cobbler, in which it's like a superhero origin movie for a Jewish guy who makes Jews. And I was like, awesome. Like, we need more stories like that. Andy Samberg just did a comic about a Jewish guy who goes home to fight neo Nazis with a bowling ball called the Holy Roller, right? Like, I want more of that. Um, when I wrote this one, um, I wanted to show that, like, yeah, we are the light into the nations and we have hope, but there's also monsters in the community, right? We have good people and we have bad people. And the question then becomes like, what do you do when you're faced with the choice between the two? And that was really ultimately what I kind of wanted to get at here. And so it's less about, hey, here's a bunch of like terrible Jews, right? Like The Sopranos, right? With The Sopranos, there's a lot of bad people in The Sopranos, but there's also a few good people in The Sopranos. And it's about like, how do I be good in a bad situation or within a bad community, right? How do I show that, I have morals or that the terrible things that I'm doing don't necessarily shape who I am as a person
Hmm.
or don't only shape who I am as a person? And so we have a lot of terrible stories in the Jewish community, right? Bernie Madoff, sexual predators, white collar crime. There's a lot of, I mean, the story that this is based on is actually inspired by a story out of Cleveland about a butcher who sold his business to a couple of brothers. This business that had been around for years and years and years, and he sold the business to these brothers. And eventually, the brothers were raided by the FBI because they'd been running like money laundering and illegal drugs out of the business. So they ruined this guy's business, his name, and that's another one of our monsters, right? And so for me, it was about that sort of gray area that what if I'm a good person at heart, but I get brought into a situation with monsters who I know, and how do I sort of navigate that? And how do I, even if I become one of those terrible people, is there a way back?
Hmm.
So for me, it's about that gray area. It's about like, we're, even within a community that's supposed to be the light into the nations and full of hope and awe and fear of God, right? There's still pitfalls and flaws. Like we're like everyone, we're flawed.
Hmm.
The Jewish community is also full of flaws, and I can see those flaws being on the inside. But for me, it was about even with my flaws, how can I return to being a good person? And what does that even mean? Like, there's various levels of what being a good Jew can mean, right? Um, I will say, I even sort of posted about today. There is a huge uptick in anti-Semitism. There is a lot. We don't have to go into it. There's a lot of reasons why Jews are being targeted right now. Um, Even this morning, in New York City, a restaurant around the corner from a place I used to live got graffitied and destroyed, and it was a terrible thing. I will say that an hour later, a group of Jews organized on Twitter went over there and cleaned it all up. And like, so, there's still terrible things happening, and there's still hopeful things happening. Um, and I think I'd like to see more of those stories, and I think I have those stories within me. But I also think that this story, whether it makes us look bad, like The Sopranos makes Italians look bad, I still think it's an important story because I think it shows that, look, we're human beings, we're flawed, we're capable of terrible things, but we're also capable of change,
Hmm.
and we're capable of learning from our mistakes. We're capable of saying, "Hey, this is something that we've noticed that we're like you said, off the rails or off the path, and how do we fix that?" And I think ultimately it's the monsters who don't who
Hmm.
don't like Chaim, our villain, who basically can't see that he's a monster, versus a Jake who can say like, what's that meme? Am I the baddie? Right? Like that
Hmm.
Nazi who's like, "Am I the bad?" Right? Not that I'm comparing Jews to Nazis. Please don't put that on the internet. That's not what I meant. But like you have to have that sort of self-awareness to say it may not be good for the Jews and may not be a story that presents us in the greatest light, but ultimately it shows that we struggle, that we're flawed, and there are ways back from that struggle and flaw to get back to that place of hope. And I hope that's what people take away from this.
Well,
Um,
one thing I liked about it was, 'cause I think I don't know if it's a stereotype or just because it's a cultural thing where the idea is, one, Jews in this country is a very small population, all things being equal. I think I can't remember what the number is. Like I think there's 14 million Jews in the world, and there's like maybe 40% of them are in the United in the States. So it's not a big population. I think there's a stereotype where they're a very cut off community from others. I think it's a good to have a look in what a community looks like. This is a normal group of people. They are just like everybody other community. I think that was a very helpful thing to be told in the story.
yeah, no, I agree. I mean, look, we do tend to stick to our own, right? Some of it is just because of how our religion is, right? We're only going to go to kosher restaurants because well, those of us who are religious and keep kosher. And most of this is me sort of coming from that up front. Like I'm not talking about somebody who's not necessarily religious or who doesn't keep kosher, keep Shabbos, or keep anything like that. But for those of us who do, we're only going to go to kosher restaurants or buy food from kosher places that sell kosher because those are the restrictions we've taken upon ourselves. Does
Hmm.
that mean that we have problems with non-kosher restaurants? No, some of us actually will go into non-kosher restaurants with friends and like we just are very aware of what we're eating or what's being prepared and what have you, right? Everybody, like I said, everybody's got their level. Um, but our communities tend to be close knit just because we're all in the synagogue together, where all of our kids go to Jewish schools together because we want them to have a Jewish education, right? So it's not that we're necessarily closing ourselves off from people, right? Like I have a lot of really good close relationships with people who are not Jewish, right? But in all walks of my life, work, comics, local soccer clubs, seeing people at the store, the local police, right? Like I'm pretty open to everybody as long as they're not calling for my blood, right? Um, Generally, I would say, especially in a community like Teaneck, like we're very open to being part of the larger community. It does seem sometimes, and I did mention it in the comic, that we stick to our own or we're very close knit just because, number one, for the reasons I mentioned, go to the same synagogue. And it's not that we're trying to keep Jews out of the synagogue, non-Jews out. It's not that we're like going to schools that are only allowing. It's just generally we're teaching Jewish studies in that school, so that's what it is. We have a lot of Jews who are in public school here too. Um, but what I would say is that um, we're pretty open. We're pretty open, but I think there's also this sense now, specifically, and I'm not going to kind of dive into it, but especially after October 7th, where you have sort of the modern American Jew, especially, who is kind of fed up and saying, um, we're not going to hide. We're not going to stand down. We're going to stand up for who we are. We're going to go out and organize and be there for one another. And ultimately, the thing that's sort of the thing that we don't really say is because who else is going to do it for us?
Mm.
And so we do, like I mentioned about the restaurant this morning, Effie's Cafe, right? Who else was going to go clean up all the graffiti? We did, right? Who else is going to go support these places? We are. Who is going to be there, if somebody is attacked or somebody needs help? We're there for our own because we have to be, just like in other communities, right? Whether they're not Jewish, even if they're not Jewish, other minorities, other races, other religions, you support one another. You support, your community, right? Because sometimes other people aren't there for you. And so, although it may seem like we're closing ourselves off, it's a little bit of defense, and it's a little bit of just naturally, because of our religious requirements, we tend to go eat kosher here and go to synagogue here, and that. So
Mm.
I'm rambling a little bit, but
That's okay.
I hope that people can understand that. I hope people can understand where we're coming from. Um, and I know that nowadays, especially on social media, things have a way of being twisted or misconstrued to fit a specific message. And I'm hoping that an interview like this, or interviews by other people sort of saying the same thing, or at local school boards or local community conversations, aren't being used the wrong way, because I think A, it's unfair, and I think B, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help
Mm.
peace. It doesn't help us all getting along.
I will say, having spent some time on TikTok, it's not good for the Jewish people right now. Was being with TikTok, and I must admit, what I find kind of concerning. I remember I had a conversation with someone not too long ago, and they're like, "I get all my news from TikTok." It's like, oof, this is why people feel the way they do.
Yeah, what was there was I'm not going to quote the statistic, but there was a statistic out there recently about the number of millennials or Gen Z who believe that the Holocaust is a myth, was a myth, right? And just the amount of people out there who think that, and I even saw on Twitter somebody recently, Twitter X, whatever you call it, somebody recently had posted a comment in response to the Holocaust saying, 6 million sounds like a lot of people. It must have been about a million, right? That's you're changing those numbers, right? Don't forget, 1945 was how many years ago, right?
Hmm.
When you think about it in terms of time, right? Like we're at 2024, it's almost a century. Another 20 years, it'll be 100 years since World War II, right?
Hmm.
Two kids, my kid, who are my kids' age, who are on TikTok, that's like myth. That's like for me, right? That's for me in the 80s, thinking about like the turn of the century, right? Like thinking about, well, my numbers are off, but thinking about prohibition or whatever, right? And so like there's a part of you that can't wrap your mind around, like when I was growing up in the 80s or college in the 90s, if somebody came to me and said, like, do you know that in 1929, during the Great Depression, stockbrokers were selling apples on the corner, right? And like part of me is like, come on, that can't be, because like you can't fathom what it was like, right?
Yeah.
And so for kids to tell, kids like, hey, 6 million Jews were killed in camps, right? I think that's a hard thing for them to wrap their mind around. It feels kind of
Hmm.
like myth. It feels kind of like a made up story, even though we have the history, even though we have pictures, even though we have recordings, even though we have books that have explained time and again what happened. Because they're on TikTok and they heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody, these it's just disastrous. It's like the plight. It's like the insidious nature of the protocols of the elders of Zion, right? Like look at that history of that document, right? This document that was made up um, to really put down the Jews, and was a completely fictional document about Jews controlling the world. Even now, even today, you see people on social media making comments like, "Well, the Jews are going to kind of control this," and come on, dude.
Well, what was it, the
If
Chappelle
I if I if I
that made a
if I
joke?
if I was controlling the world, if I had all this money, do you think I'd be writing comics for a living? I mean, come on.
Well, like I think
Probably
Chappelle on
wouldn't.
SNL just had a joke. I think just about that. Not wasn't that long ago. I was like, ooh, I don't know. That's the best way to go.
Right. Yeah, no, if I was controlling the world, like my life would be much easier. Trust me. And so I feel just back to TikTok for a second. I just feel like, and my kids are on TikTok like all day long. And there's things on there I don't want them to be exposed to, but that's just the way the world is now, right? But I find that when you talk about learning about like the Holocaust or Judaism or who we are as a people, I think there's a lot of just false narrative thrown around that you just
Hmm.
can't unhook that. You can't take that out. That's just it's like what do they say? How do you make a racist? Uh, have a dad who's a racist, right? Like there's just part of your nature that's just like that's who you are. And
Hmm.
sometimes when you get like you learn something, and I'm sure the same can be said for Jews, right? There's things that we believe, that or we believe and we say that somebody who's not Jewish would be like, how can you say that? Or how can you believe that? And you're just like, it's faith, right? Like it's just something I heard, it's something I read in a document that was made tens of thousands of years ago, and I just believe it, right? So I, I don't know. It's a weird, nuanced conversation that I am not smart enough to have. All I can say is that I don't love TikTok.
Neither do I. Like I said, especially after October 7th, it's definitely been a breeding ground for anti-Semitism, unfortunately, quite a bit. Um, so for Nice Jewish Boys, is there a sequel coming? Is there stories to tell? What's going on with that?
So there is technically there could be more story. It really kind of depends on demand, right? People want it, and they go to Comixology and tell them that they want it. Maybe we'll do more. John and I have talked about like where the story goes from here. There is definitely at least another volume that we could do. Either Return of the Nice Jewish Boys or Nice Jewish Men. Um, I don't know what we would call it, but there's definitely potential for more. But the nice thing about this story, is that we could end it here, and that's fine. And sometimes some stories don't have a sequel, and we're okay with that. So if people want us to tell more, I'm sure we do have more. Every comic I write has potential for more, until the story's finished, right? It really just depends on people. This goes for any comic book or any movie or any book out there. Like, tell the people who put it out that you want more. Tell people that you want to read more from X creators, right? The more you are vocal about what you like to the people who make the decisions about it, the better chance you have to have more of it, right? That goes for anything. That goes for Spider-Man, right? I'm sure if Spider-Man's not selling at a certain point, right, they'll stop making as many Spider-Man comics as they make. They'll still be Spider-Man because it's Spider-Man. But like at a certain point, forget Spider-Man, but like Moon Knight or
Hmm.
Blade, right? They'll cancel that book if nobody's buying it. You as the reader have to go out and say, I want more Moon Knight, or I want more Nice Jewish Boys, or I want more Saga, or I want more whatever's out there.
Hmm.
Walking Dead's done, but like any comic or story that you're enjoying, number one, support it, and by support it I mean not just buy it, but like tell others to buy it. Go out there and be like vocal about the things you like. Hey, I loved Saga. Go read more. Go read Saga if you haven't. I love Jeff Smith's Bone. I tell everybody I know to buy Jeff Smith's, amazing all ages fantasy comic Bone. Um, but if you like Nice Jewish Boys, like the first thing you do is obviously buy the comic, please, but tell others about it. Tell others how much you liked it, why it's important, why we need more of it. And then from there, you can go to a Comixology or somebody and say, hey, can we get another volume? Or hey, Dark Horse, can you print it? Or
Hmm.
hey, anybody, can you print it? Right? Like it's readers and retailers, right? Like retailers too, who have to be out there banging the drum. And bang the drum to your retailers also. Go to your retailer and say, I really like these kinds of comics. Can you stop them?
Hmm.
Right? And the retailers are the lifeblood of our industry. They're the ones out there on the front lines selling books. Um, if you don't buy books from them, they won't be there.
Hmm.
And so if you want your local comic shop, you need to support your local comic shop and support them with the books you like. And so it's all really comes down to you, the reader, right? The person who's actually walking into a store, getting online and buying a comic. If you don't support these things, they will go away.
Hmm.
And
Well,
so that's a long way of me saying there's more story. If you want it, tell people about it, talk about it.
oh, Mr. Kleid, it was an absolute honor to talk with you, sir. Thank you so much. And I do hope for a second volume of Nice Jewish Boy. Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
A fantastic night. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Adversing Stars podcast. Please help me battle those algorithms by liking and subscribing. Be sure to return for the next episode when we are visited by Chris Grant.